What is the greatest risk you've been willing to take? A time when you've been uncertain about the result of your action, your decision, but you've decided to do it anyway. Maybe your greatest risk was a financial decision when you chose to build or buy or move, to invest or spend or save. Maybe your greatest risk was a relational choice, a time when you chose to speak up about something that was on your heart, maybe to share your feelings, maybe to confess a mistake. Maybe your greatest risk was just doing something crazy, something completely out of left field, something out of character, like skydiving or bungee jumping or coming to church. Well, in Ruth chapter 3, we see people making risky decisions, making plans with huge, life-changing outcomes, choosing to act in ways that could bring incredible blessing or could leave them in destitution and despair. But before we come to our passage and these decisions, it's helpful just for us to go back to the background of them in the events of Ruth chapters 1 and 2. Because this story of Ruth happens during the dark days of the Judges, this desperate time in Israel's history when there was no king, when everyone did as they saw fit. That's when these things are happening. And our focus in this story has been the desperate situation faced by two women, two widows, Naomi, the Israelite, and her Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth. And in chapter 1, we found Naomi left empty. She fled from Israel to Moab to find greener pastures, but all she found was grief. She lost her husband, Elimelech, her sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And then God came to the aid of his people, Israel, bringing rain and relief from famine on the land. And he also opened up the way for Naomi to return home to Israel, to her hometown of Bethlehem. And we remember that when Naomi decided to return, her Moabite daughter-in-law Ruth stuck with her. Ruth treated her with incredible kindness, seeking the well-being of her mother-in-law ahead of her own well-being. And together, Naomi and Ruth returned in grief and in need of provision and protection. They wanted to come under the care of the God of Israel and the care of his people in Bethlehem. And that desire for provision and protection, that came last week in chapter 2 as we met Boaz. Boaz, you might remember, was a man with a reputation in the community. He was an upstanding man, a landowner with resources. And when Ruth, the Moabite, happened to come into his field to glean, he went beyond all her expectations to treat her well, to show kindness to her, to protect her and provide for her. In fact, he treated her with such overwhelming kindness that Ruth kept working in Boaz's field for the whole harvest. And she's amply provided for through Boaz and his kindness and generosity. And at the end of chapter 2, at the end of the harvest time, things were looking pretty good for Ruth and Naomi. It was a big turnaround. The emptiness of Moab had been partially filled by God through Boaz. But we see that not everything is resolved for Ruth and Naomi. The last verse in chapter 2 gives us a hint about this. We're told that Ruth goes back to live with her mother-in-law. Now, depending on your family situation, going back to live with your mother-in-law might be quite pleasant. You might be very okay with that idea, or it might be terrifying. But Ruth going back to live with her mother-in-law is a problem for Naomi. And it's not a problem for the reasons we might think. It's not a problem because Ruth is difficult or because their relationship isn't good. No, it's a problem because Naomi cares deeply about Ruth's well-being. We can see this in Naomi's farewell speech to her daughters back in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, Naomi said this to Ruth and to her other daughter-in-law Orpah, who stayed in the land. Naomi said this, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Now, since that farewell, Ruth has chosen not to return to her Moabite mother's home, but to make her home with her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. And through her commitment to Naomi and the death of her husbands, Ruth has lost the possibility of rest. She's let go of the possibility of lasting rest, of relational protection and reliable provision. Those things are gone. And so Naomi's wishes for Ruth in chapter 1 become real here in chapter 3. Because take a look with me at verse 1. Chapter 3, verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." So Naomi sees the problem. She needs rest. She needs provision. And Naomi sees this as her problem, a problem that she must find a solution for. And so Naomi's done her homework. She has it all mapped out by the time she shares it with Ruth, this plan that she hopes will lead to Ruth finding a solution, finding a home where she'll be provided for. Now, the target of this plan is Boaz, the same Boaz who is a relative from Elimelech's family, the family of Naomi's dead husband, the same Boaz who has shown Ruth great, overwhelming kindness as a landowner during harvest time, and the same Boaz who is a guardian redeemer of Naomi's family. Now, that's the target, Boaz. The location of the plan is the threshing floor. Ruth is to visit Boaz there because after harvest, that's where Boaz would be. His workers would have collected stacks of wheat and barley that they'd cut from the fields, and they'd be processing them at the threshing floor. It was like an open structure, ideally set on a hill near the fields. And this is how it worked in the threshing floor. You see, along with his workers, Boaz would crush the heads of grain, and then he'd throw them up in the air with a fork, letting the breeze catch the chaff and blow it away, leaving the grain on the ground to be collected. That's where Boaz would be, in the threshing floor. That's what he would be doing that night, the night of this plan. Okay, so we know the target, Boaz. We know the location, the threshing floor. But what is the plan? Well, Ruth was to set up an encounter with Boaz at night. She was to prepare for this encounter by being clean and nice smelling. That's a good start, but they're uncommon attributes for anyone who's been working hard on the land. Clean and nice smelling. And she was to wear her best clothes. Then Ruth was to watch Boaz in secret until he'd finished eating and drinking. And when he fell asleep, Ruth was to approach him, to uncover his feet and lie down. Now, these preparations might seem a bit confusing to us, suspicious at best and scandalous at worst. Because what kind of a woman acts like this, prepares like this for an encounter, waits in secret at night, uncovers and lies down like this? It appears more risque than risky. And even though it's open to interpretation, these preparations and actions, this plan, is meant to communicate something to Boaz. So washing, putting on perfume, and changing clothes is what an Israelite did to signify that their period of mourning was over. And we see the exact same things when King David finished mourning for his son. Washed, put on perfume, changed his clothes. The person would take off their grieving outfit, and they'll put on new clothes. Despite their grief, their cleanliness and their dress showed everyone that they were ready to move on. And Naomi sets Ruth up for her encounter with Boaz by doing these same things: washing, putting on perfume, changing clothes. And even knowing this, Naomi's plan for this encounter with Ruth is still risky. When well-dressed, nice-smelling, clean woman appears out of the darkness, just think about some of the many ways things could go wrong, many ways Boaz could interpret Ruth's actions. The most obvious one is that he would interpret them as the actions of a prostitute. In Judges, we've seen the low value that men have for women. Boaz could easily take advantage of Ruth when they're alone, when there's no witnesses. Or Boaz could value his reputation. He could just see Ruth and see what she's up to and kick her out. She is, after all, a foreigner and a Moabite. And at that point, provision, protection would be out of the picture. Now, we've seen men of standing fall for foreign women already in Judges. We've seen Samson doing that. And the short version is it doesn't go well. So there's lots of things that could go wrong. But Boaz could also recognize Ruth's actions and listen to her and respond well to her. But really, what are the chances that Boaz is going to wake up in the middle of the night after drinking and immediately be switched on to interpret well what Ruth is doing? So this encounter between Ruth and Boaz, incredibly risky. And if we were jumping into Ruth 3 without knowing anything else about the story, this plan wouldn't just be risky, it would be stupid. It's on the same level as my plan to make the Olympics. It's only designed to dash hopes and shatter dreams. But God has taught us some things in the first 2 chapters that help us see where Naomi's ambitious plan is coming from and why it's risky but not as ridiculous as it sounds. Because in Ruth, God has been at work showing us what he's like. He's been at work in the big picture and in the details of the lives of his people. People like Naomi and Ruth. I mean, look at his track record. God ended the famine and opened the way for Naomi to come home. When Ruth went out to scavenge for food, God led her to a field belonging to Boaz. And God protected and provided for Naomi through Boaz's overwhelming kindness. And this is the same Boaz who happens to be their close relative, a potential guardian redeemer for them. In every event and decision in Ruth, God has shown himself to be at work for the good of his people, showing us that he is almighty and in control and that he is kind, doing good for them. And so this plan in Ruth 3 isn't being made in isolation. It's not being cooked up out of nowhere. Naomi's plan and Ruth's willingness to go through with it suggest a great confidence in the kindness and sovereignty of God, built on everything they've experienced in this book already. Now, as God's people, we make our plans and our decisions in much the same way. We don't make decisions in a vacuum, but we're informed and guided and influenced by what we know about God. When we see what God is like and what he's done for us, we don't align our decisions to our desires, doing what we see fit. Judges has given us enough examples of that, and it leads to destruction. It doesn't end well. Instead, as God's people, we align our decisions to our knowledge of God, the God who has spoken to us, telling us what is good, the God who has demonstrated what is good for us in the person of his Son, the God who has given us his Spirit so we can do what is good. We make choices that align with our knowledge of God, and that's our way of life as God's people. A way of life that the Bible calls wisdom. It's this wisdom that we see here, not just in the risky plans of Naomi, but also in the risky obedience of Ruth, and then the risky response of Boaz. We'll look at them next. You see, in verses 6 and 7, Ruth does everything that Naomi has said. She prepares and she follows through with the plan. It's amazing. Ruth goes to the threshing floor. Boaz is there. He's had a good evening's work threshing the grain. He eats and drinks and lies down to sleep behind the pile of grain. Everything is going to plan. Now, once Boaz is asleep, the tables could so easily be turned, right? Ruth, the vulnerable Moabite, is now in a position of power over the sleeping man, Boaz. And knowing that she's a Moabite reminds us that we've heard this picture before. We've seen this picture before. This situation reminds us of the actions that led to the Moabite nation. Then, women took advantage of a drunken man while he was asleep. In their desperation to secure their future, they forced this man to father their children. One of those children was named Moab. That's how it all started. And it reminds us of events in Judges. A sleeping man wound up with a tent peg through his temple at the hands of a woman. Sleeping Samson was betrayed repeatedly by Delilah, a woman, as she cut off his hair and his strength was lost. And so what will this Moabite woman do to the man at his mercy? So what will this Moabite woman do to the man at her mercy? Well, in verse 7, Ruth approaches quietly, uncovers his feet, and lays down near them, just as they planned. And Ruth and Boaz remain like that. Boaz dead to the world, Ruth scared to death, until this happens in verse 8. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." You can imagine this playing out, can't you? Boaz feels that his feet are uncovered. He's getting a bit chilly, so he twists and turns to try and fix them up. And in the process of tossing and turning, he looks around and finds a woman there, right there at his feet. And he's like rubbing his eyes, trying to work out what's going on. The first thing he wants to know is who this woman is. She says she's Ruth. She calls herself his servant. And Ruth asks him to spread the corner of his garment over her. Now, this isn't her asking for more of the blankets because she's cold. And it's not her asking for sex. Ruth is using a familiar turn of phrase to ask Boaz to marry her. In Ezekiel chapter 16, we find the same turn of phrase in the context of another proposal. It's the metaphorical proposal of God to his people. In Ezekiel, God says, "I spread the corner of my garment over you. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine." That's what Ruth is asking for here. After a risky plan comes this risky request, because this is a servant proposing to her boss. This is a Moabite proposing to an Israelite. This is a woman with nothing proposing to a man of standing. And she's asking him not just to marry her, not just to take in a Moabite widow, an outsider, the lowest of the low. No, she's also asking him to take on responsibility for her family, to be a guardian redeemer. And it's an outrageous request, and it's made to a man awakened at midnight by an unfamiliar woman appearing out of darkness. And she makes it to a man with literal cold feet. It's doomed to fail, right? But in verse 10, we hear this from Boaz. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." Ruth's risky request is met with these words of immeasurable grace. It's just breathtaking, isn't it? Ruth is coming to Boaz for rest, for provision, and for protection. But even more than that, he's willing to offer her lasting rest, relational protection, reliable provision. He's willing to do everything that she's asked. Now, it's moments like this that we need to zoom out to see that the incredible things that Ruth experiences here are true for us in the gospel. You see, in his love for us, our God has sent his son, Jesus, to redeem us. And through the work of his son, God has brought helpless outsiders home. God treats people who know their unworthiness with absolute kindness. God pays the price to buy them back through the death of his son, so that people like us, no matter what we've done, no matter who we are, can come and join his family, can be welcomed into his heavenly home. And all we need to do is take the risk and ask him. Ask God to do for us what we see here in miniature. Ask God to redeem us, to bring us home. And Boaz points us to God when he says that he will do all that Ruth has asked. He will spread his garment over her. He will marry her. He will be her guardian redeemer. And with his response, boom, the fireworks light up the night sky. And it looks like our happy ending is here. And the credits start to roll as the sun rises. But the writer of Ruth stops us in our tracks, rolls back the credits, and reminds us that redemption won't be that easy. Because Boaz shares with us, as part of his answer, some heartbreaking news. The news that there's a wrinkle in his redemption. He wants to do it, but he can't do it yet. While he is a guardian redeemer for Naomi's family, he isn't the guardian redeemer for her family. If it was anyone else, this would sound like an exit strategy, a way of Boaz getting off the hook. Sorry, Ruth, I like you, but there's nothing I can do about it. Rules are rules, babe. But in the rest of their time together that night, Boaz reassures Ruth that he is still willing and he will do it. He goes to great lengths to reassure Ruth in this. So he promises her that he will sort things out with the closest relative in the morning, straight away, as soon as he can. One way or another, Boaz will make sure that Ruth will be redeemed, protected, provided for. And he also reassures her by protecting their reputation. So in verse 14, Ruth gets up early before they can be recognized by any of the other workers, by anyone who might draw conclusions about a woman being there with Boaz overnight, whether it was Ruth or someone else. He protects her in that, reassures her in that. And Boaz also reassures her by giving her a parting gift. Bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out, he says to Ruth in verse 15. Then he pours barley into her shawl, puts it on her, and then they go their separate ways back to town. Ruth with this extra provision. And Boaz goes back to sort out things with this potential guardian redeemer at the city gate. And Ruth goes back to her mother-in-law's home in Bethlehem to wait. Have you ever found yourself waiting for a family member? Then you can imagine what that night could have been like for Naomi. That after sending off Ruth with her risky plan, she wouldn't have got much sleep. She's looking out the window in hope. She's pacing a path in the floor as she's lying down trying to sleep, but running all the possibilities over in her head. And she does that all night long, you can imagine. Then in the morning, Ruth returns home, and the wait looks like it's over. But it isn't quite yet. When Ruth arrives, Naomi gets to find out the truth. How did it go? How did it go, my daughter? She asks in verse 16. And then Ruth tells her everything that Boaz had done for her, everything that happened that night, everything Boaz had said, everything he'd promised. And then the wait that looked like it was over begins again. Now, looking back on the passage at this point, it's hard to know yet if the risks were worth it, whether the wait will be worthwhile. Because even now, Boaz could cut them off. He could leave town, he could start fresh, he could ignore their plight. And if the other guardian redeemer picks up the tab, will they actually be in a better position? How will they wait for Boaz without throwing in the towel? Well, they remember the reassurance of their redeemer. You see, Boaz's gift of barley serves that purpose for Naomi while she waits. It tells her that Boaz recognizes his role in the family, that he intends to care for her. It reminds Naomi that his promise is real. He does intend to marry her daughter. Boaz's gift tells her all she needs to know about what he's doing right now. He is at the city gate. He is working things out. And it's with this confidence that Naomi says to Ruth, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And in the same way, waiting for our Redeemer can be hard. It can be risky. Despair is only ever around the next corner, in the next bout of suffering or difficulty. And I think waiting is one of the hardest and riskiest things that we do as Christians. It's always a challenge to wait well, to wait with confidence, to wait for the redemption that is to come. But we wait with the reassurance that our God has given us. See, in John 14, our Redeemer Jesus spoke about leaving his disciples. He shared with them these words, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. The words of our Redeemer Jesus are our hope as we wait. His reassurance is what we cling to. What he's done for us is what we hold on to, no matter what is happening. And when it's hard not to be sucked in by easy promises of salvation or satisfaction, we remember his words and we remember what God has done for us. Our kind God has given us a Redeemer who has prepared a place for us, a home for us, a Redeemer who gives us lasting spiritual protection and provision, a Redeemer who has promised to return to bring us home with him. Because we know the kindness of our God and we know his Son is our Redeemer, we don't give up. We don't give in to despair, no matter how long we wait. No, we wait in confidence and we endure the risk while we wait for our glorious Redeemer to return and to take us home to rest. Let's pray together. Gracious God, we humbly thank you for all your gifts so freely given to us, for life and health and safety, for power to work, leisure to rest, and for all that is beautiful in creation and human life. Above all, we praise you for our Saviour, Jesus Christ, for his death and resurrection, for the gift of your Spirit, and for the hope of sharing in your glory. Fill our hearts with all joy and peace in believing, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.